Hi, my name is Koen. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get a little bit deeper into our human resource processes. So there are quite a few things that we understand about these processes, and what we're going to offer are ways for us to think more strategically about these opportunities to look at our human resource processes. So the first thing that I like to kind of have us think about is this notion of how we even approach the hiring process, right? So what are our hiring practices? What's the process that we use to engage? Is our hiring process or even our advancement process, right? So not only people who are new to our organizations, but folks who are looking to be elevated in our organizations, are those processes and those practices transparent, right? Do we have organized interview panels? Do we have predetermined interview questions or processes? And the more we can answer those questions and the more we can have those processes, the better hiring practices we'll have, and the more not only consistency will we have, but we'll also find that we're able to diminish the negative impacts of not only microaggressions, unconscious bias, and this notion of stereotype threat, right? So the more we can say, candidates, this is what we're looking for. The more we can say, candidates, here are some of the questions that we'll be asking. The more we can say, candidates, here is our process, not only for those who making the decisions, but those who are entering into that process now understand the transparency by which they can bring their best game. Right? And so this notion of recognizing that we have to have these consistencies, that they have to be transparent, that people have to know what the steps are in this process, that we have to have organized and predetermined questions that when appropriate we send to those candidates, and that we have to also have conversations. And this is one thing I didn't mention in earlier in this thing, but we have to talk about what this notion of fit is, right? So if we have to predetermine what fit is, as opposed to on the back end saying, well, that person didn't fit, this notion of organizational fit. And so when we're able to do that, we're able to create practices that allow us to hire folks that keep us in alignment with our organization's values and goals, right? The next thing we have to talk about is this internal advancement piece. Do we have clearly defined promotional paths that are either published or outlined in a way that someone can say, you know what, I started in the mailroom, but I can actually make it to the boardroom by going through these processes. And a lot of times we know that sponsors matter. We know that being mentored matters, but we also don't oftentimes take into consideration how those things are connected in a way that an employee can recognize that if I do A, B, C, and D, I will end up with E, right? So we have to recognize that. We also want to recognize the power and the responsibility that comes with performance appraisals. Oftentimes, I have seen in my work experience that performance appraisals max out at, acceptable, right? And so what that means is if everybody's acceptable or exceptional, then who gets those performance appraisals? And what I've also found is that those people who don't come up to the kind of general population of a workforce get more performance appraisals because they're not meeting those goals, as opposed to those of us who are meeting those goals getting more performance appraisals so we can increase how we perform in the organization, right? We also recognize that oftentimes in internal advancement, there's not a lot of accountability or feedback around why I didn't get a position, or how do I become better, to advance myself in an organization. And I would go back to this around this standardized question and process. And oftentimes when we talk about internal advancement, we take certain things for granted. And so we don't do our due diligence in making sure that we're advancing equity, inclusion, and diversity. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is this notion of biased language. In our job descriptions, in our requests or our employment materials, are we gender or culturally biased in those descriptions, right? So are the descriptions themselves, do they hold a level of bias? And so that becomes important, because when we're looking for so some people will read the job description and say, I don't fit that description. They're not talking about me. That is not something that I can actually do. When in fact, they can do the job. We just have phrased it, or we've put it in terms that don't appeal or speak to them, or might not even maximize their ability. I oftentimes hear people in interviews use the collective we when interviewers are looking for what you did, but this individual, because of their cultural background, really focuses on what we did, and they participated, and oftentimes were the leaders in those things, but they think in terms of we as opposed to thinking in terms of I. And so when we think about these job descriptions, when we think about these interview questions, could there be some implicit bias in the question that will lead or limit how people respond effectively, when in fact they have the skill, they have the ability to do the thing, but the way we're asking our question, or the way we're posing an invitation, allows people to or actually boxes people out of a particular opportunity, right? The next thing is this idea of inclusive thinking. Do we think in terms of ways of looking at job performance, looking at job accountability, to see if there are skills, transferable skills that people have that may not be demonstrated by positions that they've held? Right. And I know that sounds, so it's this notion of, divergent thinking just a little bit, but are there transferable skills that folks can have that might be valuable in this position, right? As opposed to what positions have they had that led them to this position. And that requires some inclusive thinking. The next thing that I want to talk about is this idea of making sure that we have inclusive benefits, and that people feel that they won't be penalized for using their benefits. When we think about transgender care, when we think about mental health availability through our EAP programs, when we think about lactation rooms, when we think about parental leave, both for the when we think about parental leave, right? So for both fathers and mothers, right? When we think about that, so are our benefits not only inclusive, but do people feel like they can use those benefits? And so some of our HR practices need to encompass how we think about that, because if we're not, then we could be creating barriers that don't allow people access, or people don't feel like they can access without penalty the human resource products that we offer, right? The next thing is this idea of interrupting bias. Do we have standardized approaches for interrupting bias? One of those, approaches is this notion of making sure that folks don't interrupt other people, really paying attention to who talks and who doesn't, paying attention to positional authority within conflicts, right? So some of these things are bias interrupters. Are we creating opportunities for micro affirmations, right? So catching people doing positive things. Are we accentuating the behaviors that we want to see from people, as opposed to punishing them for behaviors that we don't want to see? And so how do we interrupt bias as an organization? And so those are some things that are extremely important for us to kind of think about. I want to say thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to review just really quickly kind of what we've talked about. So we talked about these bias interrupters. Do we have those formalized in our organizations, either through ground rules, through some of our processes where we have people pay attention to their bias before they engage, and then once they engage, how do they minimize their bias? We talked a little bit about this idea of having inclusive benefits. Do people feel like whatever their identity is, they can have access to our benefits without retribution, without negative retribution? We also talked about this idea of inclusive thinking, that it requires us to, if we want to be inclusive, sometimes we have to think outside of the box or think inside of the box, but in different ways about how people can engage with us. And then making sure that we don't have biased language, both in the workforce invitations that we send out, through our job descriptions, through the programs that we identify as leadership programs. Is there biased language there? Making sure that there isn't, so that we can get the best candidates and the most diverse candidates in those pools. Recognizing that it's these internal processes have to be as rigorous as our external processes. Making sure that folks are clear about what that process is, that they know how they can move from the mailroom to the boardroom within our organizations. And then lastly, recognizing our hiring processes need to be rigorous and formalized as much as possible. And people need training on how to do that. And so when we do that, we understand that this will help us dig deeper into our HR processes and allow us to align our intentions, our behaviors, and our goals with organizational outcomes. So my name is Andre Koen. Again, I want to say thank you so much for your time and helping me kind of dig deeper into human resource processes. I'm out of here. I'll see you in the next session. Thanks. Bye.